Most of what we learn in school skips the messy, uncomfortable parts of the past. But here on Raw American History, we go straight into the stories that textbooks usually leave out. Today, we're heading back to the early 1700s, before the American Revolution, before the United States, when the British colonies were still young, fragile, and surrounded by powerful native nations. It's a story of greed, betrayal, and survival, a war that nearly erased an entire colony. This is the story of the Yamasee War of 1715. By the early 1700s, the Carolina colony, what we now know as South Carolina, was booming. Rice, deerskins, and enslaved people were the main exports, and the British traders running it were making huge profits. But the foundation of all that wealth came from native nations, the Yamasee, Creek, Catawba, Appalachee, and a dozen others, who traded animal hides for guns, cloth, and tools. For a while, it worked. There were alliances, intermarriage, and diplomacy. But that trust didn't last. The British traders started cheating the tribes. They charged ridiculous prices, demanded unfair debts, and kidnapped native people to sell into slavery when they couldn't pay. By 1710, the entire system was built on exploitation. The Yamasee and their allies were watching their people disappear, their families sold, their land taken, and they'd had enough. In April of 1715, it finally exploded. A group of British officials came to the Yamasee town of Pocotaligo to talk about trade debts. But instead of another round of empty promises, the Yamasee attacked. They killed the entire delegation, traders, interpreters, everyone. It was the first strike in what would become a full-scale uprising. Within days, the violence spread across the entire colony. Yamasee warriors, joined by the Creek, Catawba, Appalachee, and others, hit British plantations, forts, and settlements. Frontier towns were wiped out almost overnight. Dozens of traders were killed. Entire families vanished. The British settlers panicked, and for good reason. There were barely 6,000 colonists in South Carolina at the time, surrounded by tens of thousands of native people. The colony was outnumbered and cut off. Governor Charles Craven called for every able-bodied man to take up arms. They fortified Charleston and begged other colonies for help. And this wasn't just a rebellion, it was a coordinated war. The Native Alliance had learned the British way of fighting. They used muskets, ambushes, and siege tactics. They knew the terrain, and for months, they were winning. Settlers fled toward the coast, leaving the interior in flames. Colonists hid behind the walls of Charleston, convinced that they'd be slaughtered next. It was one of the closest moments the British colonies ever came to total collapse. But the alliance didn't hold over. The Creeks began arguing with the Yamasee over whether to keep attacking or negotiate. The Cherokee, who had been undecided, eventually sided with the British, partly because they feared the Creeks' growing power. That decision, though, turned the tide. With Cherokee warriors now fighting against their former allies, the native coalition fractured. By the end of 1716, the war was mostly over. The British reclaimed their forts, pushed surviving Yamasee south, and re-established control. But the victory came at a cost, one that the colony would never fully recover from. South Carolina was devastated. Hundreds of settlers were dead, trade networks were destroyed, and the colony had almost no native allies left. And the British elites, well, they learned a cold lesson. Their entire economy had been built on exploitation, and it nearly destroyed them. To rebuild, they shifted focus. Instead of depending on native labor or trade, they turned to a growing import from across the Atlantic: enslaved Africans. The Yamasee War didn't just reshape the South, it helped create a massive plantation system that would define it for centuries. The surviving Yamasee fled south to Spanish Florida, where they allied with the Spanish and raided the Carolina frontier for decades afterward. The British labeled them enemies forever. The war changed everything. It exposed the greed and arrogance of the Carolina traders, the fragility of colonial power, and the unity native nations could achieve when pushed too far. It also showed how colonial governments responded when their system was threatened, not by reforming, but by doubling down on something worse. The Yamasee War is one of those moments in early American history that has been buried under the myth of peaceful colonization. But for a year and a half, the British dream of empire in the South almost ended right where it began, in fire, fear, and blood. The past isn't always clean, and it definitely isn't simple. But the more we uncover these forgotten stories, the more we see history for what it really was: raw, human, and complicated. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more episodes of Raw American History. Because history isn't always clean, it's raw.